Welcome everyone, it's Neil here from 3D Tutor, back today with another complete scene build. And this time we're creating a stylized woodland scene environment. And if you're interested in how long this scene actually took to create and what we thought the difficulty level was, then stay till the end where we'll give you a dedicated breakdown of each part. This will include a difficulty from 1 to 10 of how hard we think it will be for you guys to recreate this scene. This scene comes with its own blend file, not only so you can see how the scene was created, but also so you can actually use the trees and foliage I have created. You'll also get the high poly versions of my trees just in case you want to bake your own textures out. Everything is named and ready to go. Oh, and also there's an Unreal Engine 5 texture pack as well. So whether you want to use Blender or Unreal Engine, the choice is up to you. Links to the Gumroad are down below, and of course it's free to all of our Patreon members, along with over 250 hours of Blender courses. So be sure to check those out. And every Monday, right here on our YouTube channel, you'll find a tutorial covering some of the techniques in depth that you'll find in our complete scene builds. As always, if you want to get your ideas featured in one of our scenes, then drop your comments down below, and we've had some amazing ideas so far, and at least 2 of them are in the works. Finally, all the techniques you see here in these scene builds are covered in our massive library of over 20 courses and 200,000 downloads, so be sure to check those out. But enough of all that, what you're here for is to see how we put this scene together. So let's get started on our stylized woodland scene environment. Hello everyone and welcome to the stylized woodland scene modeling part of this guide. And as you can see, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually bring in the bark. So I'm going to make a start on the bark first because I think it'll be easier to do that. And then what I'm doing is I'm actually just greyboxing out how I actually want my leaves to actually go onto the actual bark. We want it heavily stylized in this one, so we are looking to make simple shapes in the beginning. So you can see here, I'm just placing them out how it's going to go, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to randomize these up then, just to get variation in all of those shapes. So you can see already the kind of look of a fern or conifer that we're actually going for, and now basically I'm just bringing solidify, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a knife tool and actually cut little bits out of the actual leaves, just to give it a really nice look. So you can see here now I've cut it away and it looks really nice actually. So the thing is, if you leave it with the solidify on without actually applying the modifier, you can get a good idea of where it looks like before you actually finish and actually commit to actually what it's going to look like. I can then actually go in and change the thickness if I need to, or make the cuts a little bit different very easily without having to worry about 2 sides of the mesh. So basically all we're doing here is cutting out actually a plane, and then the solidifier is doing the work for us. And you can see how quick that actual process was. Now I'm doing is I'm just duplicating the tree, making some actual variations of it. So the first thing I'm doing the height, just bending them a little bit. That's the first variation I do, and then what I'll do is I'll go in and actually change the leaves a little bit. You can see I bend that one a little bit too much. It's more like a Christmas tree. So you can see I'm rotating on the Z axis, on the Y, on the X, just to make them look very different from each other, so that we can use them a few times within our scene. I mean, we could use these hundreds of times and they'd still look very different from each other. So then now I'm doing the rest of the scene where I'm just actually putting out the trunk where we're actually going to, well, it's a stump where we're going to actually cut the logs on, and then some logs. And now I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a quick normals check just to make sure they're all facing the correct way, and then send it through to Zbrush. Now in the beginning, when I first sent this through to Zbrush, I wasn't sure how I was actually going to start, whether I was going to dynamesh it, or whether I was just going to subdivide it or something like that. You can see that what I'm using is the snake hook. It actually really effective when it came to actually creating those branches. And then all I did was I masked the ends of them, actually separated them away, deleted those ends, went back to the actual trunks, and then re-dynameshed it, and it gave it that really nice flat look as what we're looking for. At the moment, as you can see, they look very soft and flimsy. But I wasn't worried at this stage because I knew I was going to really roughen them up. So you can see that look that we got there and how easy it was to do. So now what I'm doing is I'm just going in with my clay, and generally when I'm creating trees, I don't actually use that many brushes. I'll use my clay, I use my dynamic, trim dynamic, and really that's about it. I don't ever smooth them off, so just don't try and smooth anything off. Always try and actually use something like trim dynamic or H polish brush, and you'll get a really good result. And you can see already how they're really starting to come together now. All that softness is gone. They look really rough and ready and actually like tree bark. Just making the final checks now on each one, just making sure I've gone over all the parts so nothing looks too soft or anything like that. Even though actually these trees will be hidden by the leaves, I still wanted to make sure every part of it was done right, just in case you could actually see through. So you never know in the scene if you're going to be able to see through, so I just made sure they're all okay. Now I'm doing is I'm just using the move tool, pulling out the bottoms of the actual trunks just to make sure they're a lot thicker at the bottoms. And now I'm thinking, okay, so how do we attack these actual leaves? So the first thing I'm going to do is subdivide it, and then I will go in and decimate it, and finally I'll come down and actually smooth everything out. So you can see then dynameshing, and I'm doing them all pretty much at the same time, and then I'm polishing. There, polishing on the deformation tab, and I'm polishing it by crisp edges just to keep some of those edges on the actual leaves. And now again I'm going in with my clay. So clay is probably my favorite brush, and you can see the result that I'm looking for basically is when I take this into Substance Painter, I'm looking to get a really good curvature map off of my actual leaves and things like that. So I know that if I can get some really nice strokes on top of these leaves, like what I'm doing there, you can see I went a little bit too close, and I just had to inflate it and then re-dynamesh it because it was starting to come through the mesh. And I'm just working my way along these now, actually doing the same thing, just the same process over and over again, just with clay, just making those strokes. Try not to make the strokes as long as possible, as you can see. Not short, we don't want short strokes or anything like that. But you can see pretty much all of this so far has been done with two brushes and the move tool, of course. So I'm doing a check now just to see what it's going to look like if I do decimate it down. Will I be able to get away with actually unwrapping these? Will they actually get a nice bake onto the low poly mesh and things like that? Now I'm just pulling out the branches, just making sure it all fits properly. I don't want them sticking into the leaves, for instance, or anything like that. And that's before I actually start messing around with high and low poly. Of course, you want your high poly to be exactly over your low poly, so that's why I'm actually moving those branches now before doing that. And now we're just back to the leaves. The leaves were pretty tedious to make because it's just basically going over the same thing, but I think the results are really good. And actually, it didn't take that long. Probably took, I don't know, something like 40 minutes, something like that, to actually complete the trunks and the actual leaves, so not too long at all. And again, you can see that I'm really careful that I don't go quite up to those edges and destroy that edge that we've got there. Even though it's not a sharp edge or anything like that, I don't want it coming out too much and destroying them, so I'm just very careful about doing that. If I do go over them, make the brush too small and we've got little spots there, I will then use the actual smoothing, and then I'll just go over it again. So you can see here I've got them all together now. I'm just renaming them bark underscore high and bark underscore low, and I'm doing that because I know when I send them through to Substance Painter, that is how Substance Painter reads the actual meshes, so I know then I can bake them against each other. It's a lowercase as well. It's the high and the low always need to be lowercase. That's the what it actually comes in Substance Painter as. So now I'm just making a quick trunk here to a stump, to actually where we're going to stick the axe in. And where it looks as though we're woodcutters in the middle of the forest, actually going away, just a bit of storytelling, as we do with all of our scenes. Now you could do a lot of this in Blender for sure. In fact, you could do it all in Blender with the sculpting part, but I just find using Zbrush much easier for me. So I can swap between them pretty well, and that's the way that my workflow is quickest, so that's why I do it this way. But if I had to, and there was no Zbrush, yeah, you could absolutely do this in Blender. Now I'm just checking the silhouette. As you can see up the top left as I'm decimating them down. And now we're just trying to get as low as possible before sending it through to Blender. Now I do know when it comes through to Blender that I've still got an option of decimating a little bit more. What I tend to do is decimate pretty low in ZBrush and then finish the decimation off in actual Blender. Now I'm bringing them into Blender, and what I'm doing is I'm scaling them to make sure that they're the right size. That's one of the checks that you should always do. Make sure everything's scaled to the correct size. If you don't do that, you can mess around with things like physics. When you send them through to someone else as well, it's just going to be a mess for them, so they then have to start rescaling. So just get into the habit of importing a human into the scene to give you some sense of scale, and then start building from there normally. With these trees, it wasn't that hard. Obviously, I could just bring them in and then just scale everything up at the same time, because it wasn't a complex scene or anything like that. So now we're in Substance Paint, and what I'm doing is I'm checking this before I actually send it through to Loop to actually do the painting. I'm just making sure that it's all going to work okay. I'm doing a few bakes just to make sure that everything's okay. You can see there I baked out the actual branches and things like that first, and then I came back to the leaves. And you can see that I am having some problems with the bake, so what I'm starting to do is turn that down. Now you can see got a beautiful bake off of there, so I know then when I send that through to Loop, everything's going to be fine. Because he will obviously turn down the raycast just a little bit, whether it's the inside or the outside, just to make sure the bake's perfect anyway. But what I don't want to do is send him through some trees where the bake, you just can't get a good bake off it, so that's why I'm checking that. So now we're just making a very simple axe. I could have spent a lot more time on this axe and made it a lot better. I wasn't really happy with the topology on it. It was mainly about the trees. This was just an afterthought really, and I thought, okay, I've got a little bit of time, so I'll put that in. We're actually working on another scene at the moment, so this was a very quick scene to put together just to show you what everything's going to look like. And now we're moving on to the Stylized Woodland scene foliage part of the build. So you can see I brought in my guy straight away, and what I'm going to do is we decided that we're not actually going to use planes on this one. We're actually going to use 3D meshes instead, give that a try. We like to experiment a little bit sometimes, so for a grass this time we decided to do it this way. We're going to make them relatively simple. We could have took these planes into ZBrush and really add a lot of detail to the meshes and things like that, but I didn't want to do that. So what we're doing here is we've got all of our actual planes there, as you can see, and we're just pulling them out now. Like so, and you can see that they're still planes right now. I haven't actually solidified them. What I'm doing is I'm just moving them around, trying to get some different variations in them. Like so, and then making another smaller clump of grass to give Lou a few actual options to actually play around with his grass. The main thing is here making sure that if you're looking from the side or anything like that, that the grass doesn't look actual thin and you're seeing straight through it. You can actually see there's actual depth to it. Now I'm going to solidify and smoothing everything off and just making sure they look right. And now finally we said, well, why not add a few flowers in as well, just to really brighten the scene up. So that's what we're actually doing now. So you can see there, I'm using the array based on an actual empty, spinning that round, and that then gives us the ability to make these actual leaves. Really simple process, really effective. Just bending them out now, 2 types of leaves, and now I'm just going to do the center of the plants. Again, something really simple, just getting a cylinder, beveling it off, and there we go. So now I've got them both, I'm just going to actually bring in now a curve, Bezier curve, because the Bezier curve, when you first bring it in, fits these plants perfectly actually, so that's why I used it. And now we're moving on to the last flower, and all in all this probably took 20 minutes at the most, I would say. Not very long at all, so very quick build if you want to do this one. And there we go, that's the flowers done. And again, what I'm going to do now, as I always do, make sure that you rename everything, make sure everything's in the right collection and things like that. And what I'm actually going to do, because I know these as foliages, I'm actually going to place them in the center of the world, and I'm also going to make sure that the orientation is placed at the actual bottom, so that when Luke brings them in Unreal Engine 5, they're going to actually come in at the bottom where the grass should be, so basically on the floor. Same with the flowers, and that's exactly why we're doing it like that. Alright everyone, so I hope you enjoyed that, I hope you got a lot out of it, and now on with the show.
Now, in order to start off my texturing process, I opened up the trees and the logs within Blender just to check how the UVs look like and if all the normals are facing forwards. I do this all the time before doing my texturing process, just to make sure that all the meshes are set up in exactly the same way I want them to be. So for example, an axe on a log, I wanted it to be not baking ambient occlusion in between them, and I wanted to be them as a separate object. So I just raised an axe above the log, and then I'm going to put it back in within the Unreal Engine itself. So after I was done with that, I also checked out the low poly and high poly. In Substance Painter, I'm going to be using by mesh name baking, which will allow me to basically separate each one of the meshes based on its naming. I'm also creating a high poly version of the axe real quick, just because it needs to have a mesh with the same type of naming. And otherwise, if it just has a low poly version but without the high poly version, it wouldn't give us any of the kind of curvature maps or any of the normals from it, so it would leave it as an empty low poly asset. I also use this chance to give it a quick kind of bevels on the front end, because I kind of wanted it to make it just a little bit extra with the detail. And after I was happy with it, I went ahead and exported low poly as an FBX as well as a high poly as an FBX, like separate kind of meshes. And then I imported low poly version onto the Substance Painter, and I used high poly version just to bake out those kind of higher details. Then I baked it out in a lower resolution first, because I wanted to test it out and see how the details are going to turn out to be with the kind of ray traced distance that are of my choice. So after I was happy with that, I went ahead and increased the resolution to 4K for the baking, and I went ahead and baked the details out. After checking it out, I realized that I made a bit of a mistake, and I wanted to fix up a little bit of some of those overlapping baking details that I had. But once I was done with that, I went ahead and continued my texturing process. I started off with the leaves because I really wanted to get into it with the greenery and all, because that's going to determine the main kind of aesthetic of the scene. So I wanted to get kind of a vibrant colors to start off, since it was a stylized scene. And because of it, I started off with a really saturated green color, and afterwards I used curvature maps masking to just kind of highlight some of those edges. And because we're using high poly baked detail as well from these trees, I was able to get some nicer kind of detail from within the plain looking mesh itself. It was really nice. I was using also the curvature with combination of height map just to kind of bump out those details from the high poly version bakes, just to get a little bit more of an intensity out of them. And I think it turned out pretty well. I'm also using curvature generator mask and setting it up to be set as a cavity mask in order to darken those cavities that we have for the trees, for the leaves, and just get more color variation out of them as well. So I was really happy with the way it was turning out. The flow of the entire tree was going out pretty well, but then I figured that I need to get a little bit more depth out of them. So I decided to use ambient occlusion and get some additional darken up kind of colors from between those leaves. So I was really happy with the way this turned out. Then I decided to highlight some of the edges of the leaves, and I wanted to try out to use kind of let's say a highlighter, dark highlighter, to just get the shape a little bit more out and highlight this overall kind of a form. But in the end I didn't quite like it, so I went ahead and turned it down by quite a bit. So afterwards, after that, I went ahead and continued on with the texturing process for the bark this time. Luckily I had a really nice stylized bark that I was able to just plunk it in and use it, that I created for another scene. So I just plunked it in, and because they were already set up with smart materials, it already worked pretty well by default. I just made sure to mask out the log ends. Things wouldn't look quite as well. And then I realized that I'm going to fix up the baking textures. So I went ahead and quickly changed up the raycast just to get a sharper kind of generated texture, especially for the curvature as well as for ambient occlusion, because ambient occlusion, by increasing the secondary rays, you're able to get a much nicer, kind of a smoother result out of those textures. So with that, I'd be able to make use out of them and get much better results when I was using them as masks. So with that in mind, I was just continuing on the process. I realized that the colors are quite nice, but I want to get additional kind of detail out of those stylized trees. And right now I'm overlaying multiple grunge maps on top of one another, just trying out the values and seeing how they look, just to get a sort of reflection out of these trees that would be more pleasing to the eye. And when I was happy with it, I decided to move on. I wanted to mask out an axe first because I will need to use a different kind of material for the handle, since I didn't think it would have the right type of color. Originally I thought the wood ends and the handle would be the same material, but it didn't turn out quite as well, so I decided to use a different material later on. But now I'm just still playing around with the wood ends. I decided to use a black kind of a texture as a foundation just to see how I'm masking out these kind of values and how they're turning out to be. So right now I'm just doing it for every single wood end bit because I want them to have kind of a cut off branch sort of a look, because in the end I am making an axe and all the chopped off log bits, so it's going to look as if the ends were kind of chopped off. So after I was happy with that, I decided to go on to Photoshop, and because I had already texture maps for log ends, I decided to make use out of them and just simply isolate each one of them within a kind of a square texture map to use them as alphas. So I think they turned out quite well, and if you'd like to make use out of them, you can always find them within our Gumroad completely for free. I'll make sure to add a link down in the description below, so if you want to make use out of them as well, please go ahead and do so. So after I was happy with the way my alphas turned out, I went ahead and tried to make use of them. I wanted to try out to just play around with the level values as well, but in the end I just used them by default. I just simply increased the height map and slightly darkened them up a little bit just to get a more color variation out of those wood ends. So after I was happy with that, I went ahead and just simply stamped it out within every end of the branch, just like that. So once I was happy with the way my results were turning out to be, I went ahead and simply put myself multiple variations. Oh, by the way, I'm also using an angle jitter, which will basically randomize your angle rotation for the alpha, just to make more of a variety for these props. Will give you a more organic type of result. So after I was happy with that, I went ahead and continued my texturing process. I wanted to make some more extra tweaks for the log ends, especially for the bigger kind of a stump. I wanted to make sure it blends in nicely with the entire bark, so I just made sure I copied the mask from the bark and inverted it. That way it gave me a nice kind of a blend between the bark and the wood ends, and I made sure I do that because otherwise the height maps would kind of overlay with one another and would give you kind of a noise that's just random. So I don't want it to happen like that. So basically that's why instead of overlaying one material on top of another and then just using a mask to mask it out, I decided to mask out the bark material entirely and just invert that mask for the wood ends. That's the way I've done it. And then later on, I decided to play around more with the values of the leaves, since I now have a bark that I quite like, and I want to make sure that it will fit kind of with one another. And then once I was happy with it, once I was happy with the highlight of the entire shape, I went ahead and exported out the textures. I made sure I used 4K resolution this time, because I am planning to have some really nice close-up shots of it, and I just wanted to make sure it's not going to be pixelated. So after that, I went ahead and continued the texturing process, this time for the foliage. I started off with the foliage in the middle, and then I realized that I might as well texture them all at once, but in order for me to do that, I wanted them to be baked with ambient occlusion and whatnot, so I had to actually split them up into the sides like so. And also, after checking them out and seeing how they look, I wanted to kind of have them with the same base, the initial where the ground starts, so I decided to use a tool called Bisect in Blender real quick, just to make sure I get a nice kind of a base foundation for the way I want it to be. And the reason I'm doing it mainly because later on I'm planning to use a gradient based on the position within Substance Painter, and just to kind of mask out the bottom bits, just so I could have more control over where my masks are going, and just to make sure that the area where they touch the foundation of the terrain isn't going to be affected by certain textures. So once I was happy with that, I went ahead and quickly also did a bit of an unwrap. I wanted to make sure that they're in the way that I kind of want them and prefer them to be. Since this foliage is a three-dimensional kind of mesh, usually I just prefer to work with planes, but because it's such a small scene and I just want to try out working with 3D foliage, which definitely gives you a more depth and kind of a, as well as a stylized sort of a look. But if you're overusing it, obviously it's going to be a little bit more performance heavy, especially if you're using vertex motion just to simulate kind of a wind and motion of the foliage. But once I was happy with that, I went ahead and used curvature masks and such just to get the type of result that I want. I made sure I highlight the edges of the grass, as well as the using curvature mask that was inverted and maxed out a little bit, just to get a little bit of a darkened bit in the middle of that grass, just again to get more of a stylized kind of a look, as well as give it a bit more of a depth to it. So once I was happy with that, I also did a quick coloring for the flowers, and I tried to not overdo it because obviously they're going to be tiny and going to be barely visible to the camera, so I just made sure that the base color was correct. And once I was happy with it, I went ahead and exported them out. In order to start off my process within Unreal Engine 5, I firstly went ahead and went back onto the Blender file for the meshes, and I just wanted to make sure that each one of them are combined and then split apart based on the asset itself. Because beforehand what I did was I made sure that they're split based on the material. This way I was able to work within Substance Painter much easier, and I didn't have to switch between the materials in order to get the results that I wanted. It also helped me to get the consistency throughout the texturing process, so it was much nicer and easier to do. But anyways, once I was happy with the way I split off each and every object into multiple pieces, I went ahead and exported them out as a single FBX file, and then imported them into a new Unreal Engine project. Combined meshes ticked off, and it was super easy and nice to get all the assets in one place. I just made sure I use an empty project and basically dragged every asset just to make sure that each and every single one of them is in kind of a right scaling. So once I was happy with that, I went ahead and imported the textures. I made sure that the sRGB is ticked off on the ones that use combined textures. So ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic was combined into one piece. That is the preset that you can use within Substance Painter, and you just have to make sure that sRGB is ticked off for it. So once I was happy with a kind of a simple default PBR material, I went ahead and created a material instance and just simply connected every texture map that I wanted. And later on, I just went ahead and replaced the references for each and every single one of the materials that was imported, just to make sure that they're easily replaced. I actually forgot to do that for the foliage, so I had to manually go into the static meshes and just simply replace the materials for them. So once I was happy with that, I went ahead and created a disk using modeling mode. You can enable this mode, by the way, through the plugin window. And once you enable it, I basically created a quick disk as a primitive shape, and then used deformation just to kind of bump the middle, the center of it. And afterwards, I went ahead and decimated the mesh just to get more vertices, since I'm planning to use vertex painting. I just made sure that they have a kind of a basic UV unwrap, which I'm able to later use and scale it up and down with the material. And by the way, the material that I'm using for this terrain, I'm just making use out of a material that I created from a wagon course, and if you want to check it out, you can always do so. I'll make sure to attach a link to it on the upper right section of the video. But all it is basically it's a height lerp with two texture materials, and I just replaced the textures for it. And after I was happy with it, I also did another lerp that was based on the opacity mask. And basically this allowed me to kind of shape my terrain the way I wanted, just by painting in that kind of opacity and build up the foundation in any shape or form I want. Right now by default I'm using kind of I'm still trying to figure out the way and shape that I want, and just using a sphere, but later on I'm just going to switch that around because I didn't like the default kind of a sphere look for this particular scene. So right now I'm just playing around with the foliage. I'm also I'm painting down the terrain a little bit. So right now I'm blending in the values between the grass material and the soil material, and just making sure that the overall kind of a basis of this terrain doesn't look like it's being looped for those textures. So I'm just making sure that I'm breaking apart this kind of seamless textures, but I'm also making sure that it doesn't look like it's completely random for this terrain. So if you notice, it just has kind of shapes that are a bit random, but at the same time it has a bit of a flow that goes around the terrain. So with that in mind, later on I'm trying out new things a little bit. I'm checking out the terrain textures because it wasn't looking quite as well, and I think what it was is it didn't plug in the metallic value, so I just had to make sure I go back to the material and set it up as a 0. Otherwise it was just giving a weird kind of a glossiness effect towards my material. But once I fixed that up, I went ahead and started playing around with the trees. I realized that it was kind of giving me seemingly random positions, and turns out it was because I totally forgot about the pivot points. So I went ahead and used modeling mode, which is honestly a lifesaver, and just simply reposition my pivots to the center, the base of each of the assets, and that way I was able to then import all the assets into the foliage mode and just simply place them out using single tool selected, and just with that I was able to customize where my trees are going to be going. So after I was happy with that, for the trunk and the logs, I just made sure I placed them in manually as separate assets, and then I did the same for the foliage as well. I just repositioned the pivot points, so when I'm using them with foliage, they would be placed nicely on the ground. So after I was done with that, I went ahead and did some vertex painting for the bases of each and every foliage. I made sure to apply them onto the mesh so it would be used on each and every single one of the grasses for whenever they're placed with the foliage tool. And basically I just masked out the bottom section and just made sure that I do so because I wanted to add some simple wind system to move the grass around. So I just had to make sure that the bottom of the foliage doesn't move, otherwise it would kind of wiggle around like some sort of a noodle, and we obviously don't want this to happen. So after I was happy with that, I just played around with the values, with the intensities, and just got like a nice kind of a flow for them, look really nice within the scene. So once I was happy with that, I started playing around with the way they're going to be placed around. I wanted to have some variation, so right now I just started off by kind of randomizing where each and every bit is going to be around, and I just placed it at random, and I made sure I untick all the flowers and simply use the grass, because obviously we don't want the flowers to be kind of overwhelming the scene. So in that regard, using just the grass kind of foliage is much easier for that. So after I was happy with the placement of the flowers, I went ahead and kind of played around with the foliage, the grass itself, and made sure that the density for them is much larger. And by the way, I'm making sure that the foliage for the grass has a lighting the shadows ticked off, and that is because it is quite performance heavy. So I just made sure that it's being off for that. In regards to the trees, there are obviously much less of that, so we didn't need to turn that off. But for the grass, you really want to turn that off, because otherwise, especially for the 3D kind of a foliage, you don't want it to be affecting your performance too much, and you want to have a smooth performance while working on the scene, as well as rendering out the bits and animating them. So anyway, once I was happy with that, I went ahead and then played around with the entire shape of the way this forest is looking, this kind of a section. I wanted to make sure I break down the terrain and just kind of go between trees, and where the trees are getting closer, I make sure I pull away the terrain a little bit more and just make sure to go around each and every asset like that. And because I wanted to have a camera at the front, I decided to have a little bit more of an extra field for that, and just have a bit of a kind of a gravel for it, just to break off the environment a little bit more, as well as just to kind of have an area for where like a lumberjack would come in, and because there's more of a motion walking and whatnot, obviously the foliage wouldn't be there as much. So basically right now I'm just playing around and trying to figure out how to break apart this kind of a terrain. And I'm now realizing that maybe the foliage isn't just quite enough for that. I'm trying to figure out what to do, and luckily I had some additional rocks that I was able to use from my previous environment, and I just made sure I just quickly import them in. And they're really simple, and they're just decimated meshes with automatic UV unwrap and curvature texture applied just to kind of highlight the shape of the entire rocks. Right now I'm still trying to figure out and play around how it's going to look for the entire environment. I'm using selection from within the foliage mode just to play around with the trees, the positioning of them as well, and how they're going to turn around. I'm making sure that it is, although it's kind of seemingly randomized, I'm using the trees to just break up the silhouette for this entire environment. And some of them are going to be going one way while the other ones are going to be going the other way. And at the same time, overall, they're kind of going outwards from the environment, that the trees, especially the ones that are going outside of the terrain. So this way I'm just able to break apart this kind of environment, the scene for this forest just a little bit more. But basically now I'm just importing the trees and trying to figure out what to do with them, how to make them how to make use out of them to just break them apart, this entire environment. And I really wanted to make sure I use them on the sides of this terrain. And I started off with a bit of larger rocks, and I make sure that they're not kind of randomly scattered. Instead it'd be more kind of clusters. I tried to pack them up with like 3 rocks per cluster, and then maybe add smaller rocks later on. But right now I'm also making sure that they have random rotation for whenever I'm placing them down, and also they would have a random scaling as well as random placement in the Z-axis as well. So some of them would go inwards towards the terrain, while others would be popping out a little bit more. This would create a much natural look towards these rocks. So after I was happy with that, I just make sure I create some small clusters so they wouldn't be completely random, and I use them in order to kind of break apart this entire terrain for the edges. Also, just to make sure that's not only on the edges, I make sure to add some of the rocks on the middle section as well, especially for where the dirt is, just to make sure there's a little bit more consistency throughout this tiny kind of environment. So afterwards, after that, I then decided to add some smaller rocks, and actually I wanted to break apart the environment, the terrain a little bit more, and the way the terrain kind of connects with the rocks. So I just made sure I paint the vertices again using the same method, just to kind of lower the opacity for the mask. And with that in mind, I was able to kind of get some nice connections, and basically where there is a bit of a terrain sticking out from the rocks, I just made sure I kind of removed the opacity for them, just again to kind of make a nicer silhouette and to break apart the entire kind of mesh for the terrain. So after I was happy with that, I went ahead and just quickly did some refinements. Honestly, it's all about the refinements. I just wanted to add a little bit extra detail, like in the middle and whatnot, just checking out how the forest would look like with the other kind of trees, and playing around with basically the foliage mode as well as the vertex painting mode, and just getting all that kind of a nice detail in together to be just making an entire scene nicely put together. So right now, after I was happy with the way the rocks were placed, I'm adding more foliage on top of it, and I'm just making sure that none of the foliage is actually sticking through the rocks. So I'm just making sure I'm deleting some of the foliage from within the rocky areas. But once I was happy with that, I went ahead and added the post-process effect and just basically played around with the values, especially with the contrast, the global contrast and the global gamma, just to get a nicer color variation out of this entire scene. And then in order to get a nice kind of a gradient, I basically used a solid color for the base, and then afterwards, in order to transition from that color, I'm using an exponential height fog, which gives me a nice kind of result if I change the color for that fog as well. And just to make sure it doesn't affect the scene too much, in order for it to work properly, I had to increase the density for it, but just to make sure it doesn't affect the scene, I make sure that the starting range for the fog is quite a huge value, so it doesn't affect the environment in a single bit. So after I was happy with that, I then played around with smaller pebbles. I realized that I kind of want to break apart the terrain texture just a little bit more with smaller kind of rocks, and I went ahead and did just that. And I added a little bit more certain rocks in those areas around trees, especially just to break apart the base of those stylized trees, and just to make it not so obvious for when they're sticking to the ground. So after I was happy with that, I went ahead and played some more with the post-process effect just to get the kind of a vibrant color that I wanted. And the way you usually play around with the post-process effect is you just increase the value to a max and increase it, and then put the values down to negative values and just see what kind of results you're getting. And with that in mind, you're able to figure out what exactly is being affected within your lighting using the post-process values. So with that in mind, I think I also used not only global, I used the shadow post-process effects just to get real nice results. And right now what I did was basically I tried to import all the camera setup that I did for the alchemy table, by the way, which if you want to check out, there's a video that we did previously, and it really had some I think it really had some really nice animation shots. So I tried to make use out of that, but I couldn't figure out how to import the cameras properly. But the basics of it was there, but there were no animations. And if anyone knows how to import them in properly, please leave a comment down in the description below, because some of the shots I really wanted to have kind of a similarity to it. I really like to start off with my first shot of it being kind of a zoom in with the camera while the focal length is being increased, and that way you're able to get kind of a shot where an entire environment kind of warps around your camera, and I think it turns out really nice kind of a shot. I really like the way they're turning out. And the second shot, obviously we need a turntable, so what I did was I just got like an object, any type of object will do, and I'm attaching it to the camera. I'm just making sure that the object that I'm using is basically set with in-game visibility being invisible. You can do that within a details tab of an asset, and basically when I press play, those orbs that I'm using, the spheres, the primitive spheres, are not going to be visible, so that will be okay. But they definitely just help you to visualize where each of the pivot points are for every camera. So with that in mind, I'm just using a level sequencer just to put everything together, and sometimes I use transformation on camera, while other times just having some motion or rotation for the focal points, the primitives that I'm attaching my camera onto, and using them in combination will give you some really nice results. So right now I'm just getting multiple shots. I'm still not sure what exactly I'll be using for the final kind of renders and for the final edits, but I'm just making sure I'm getting plenty of kind of shots that I want, and I think will look good. And later on I'll be able to cut them up the way I want them to be. But after I was happy with it, after I was done with them, I just went ahead and rendered each and every one of them out. And that's going to be it, guys. For the modeling part, trees were not too hard to create. It was just getting a good technique down. They were created with 2 to 3 brushes. I think they would be a good choice for beginners and relatively easy to follow along, at least for the modeling section. Just be sure to create a decent curvature map from all the bumps. The hardest part for the trees for anyone new will be creating the low poly, as you will need to test and understand what parts of the topology are not working. This is something that takes a little time to learn. Foliage was also relatively easy to create and was simply using the blender knife tool and moving the blades of grass around. Flowers were created with just an array following an empty, so pretty simple stuff for beginners. All in all, the difficulty for the trees I'd say would be 6, and for the foliage I'd give it a 3. So combining them two together, giving it an average 4.5, and let's just round it up to 5. In the texturing part, we're mainly using solid color materials and blending them up together with a couple of basic masking techniques. All in all, it wasn't too complex, but I'd say the hardest part was the preparation work, which we had to do before texturing. We used high poly meshes and baked them onto low poly, and had to make sure we baked them by mesh name as well. This was in order to get proper results for the baked texture maps and avoid bleeding artifacts. But after all of that, we mainly made use out of the curvature generator and got some really nice color blends, which can be somewhat of an overwhelming thing for a beginner, but by just playing around with the values, you're able to get some really nice results. So all in all, I give it a solid 5 for texturing part, as it didn't require us to make a whole lot of new materials for the scene. Plus the scene is a stylized one, so by going with a simplistic yet vibrant textures that stand out was quite a simple task, as we didn't have to make them look too believable. For the Unreal Engine 5 part, we had to set up most of our props using foliage tool, which can be a little irritating to start with, especially if you're a beginner. But once you get the hang out of it, you can get some real nice results with the help of implemented randomness to help you get some sort of a more organic type of a look. The most complex part was probably the setup for the terrain material. It had to be a mix of textures based on a height information to get nicer blending in between them, as well as having it to be set up with opacity masking based on a vertex painting, which allowed me to basically sculpt out a form for the terrain edges, which is why I will be giving it a difficulty of 6. But other than that, majority was mainly just fine-tuning the environment values and forms and just basically figuring out how each one of the assets are blending with one another in order to create out the form for the scene. So yeah, all in all, it was a really fun scene to work on. I really hope you enjoyed the video for this stylized woodland tree scene. Make sure to give us a like if you did, and don't forget to drop a comment down below of what you would like us to do next. Also, check out the links down in the description below to see the massive library of courses we have available, which are free to anyone that signs up for our Patreon. We also have some free goods on our Gumroad, things like texture packs and some models for anyone to download. And that'll be all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.